recording. Hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Richardson, and I'm the Assistant Director of Ecumenical and Pastoral Initiatives at the Nesti Center for Faith and Culture at University of St. Thomas in Houston. And I'm here today with these lovely ladies to talk about the Open Wide Our Hearts Symposium and the fruit that's come from that, especially at St. Ignatius Catholic Church. So I'm here today with Gloria Aldridge. She's a parishioner at St. Ignatius. Amy Auzenne, she's the Pastoral Associate for Evangelization and Formation at St. Ignatius. And then Nora Creech, who was the chair for the symposium with the Nesti Center for Faith and Culture. So thank you all of you for joining me today to talk about this with everyone.
Thank you so much for inviting us, Bridget.
Well, great. Let's just get it started. Amy, if you'll go ahead and give us a brief overview of what is Open Wide Our Hearts for someone who's never heard of that document before.
Okay, so this is actually my copy of Open Wide Our Hearts. It's a letter that was put out by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And of course, the bishops occasionally put out letters on different issues that are of particular concern to the faithful. And in this case, they decided that they needed to put out a pastoral letter on racism. The full title of the document is Open Wide Our Hearts, The Enduring Call to Love, a Pastoral Letter Against Racism. And so the document is fairly short. It's not, you can see this is a booklet. It's not even a book, it's a booklet. And it's laid out in a very straightforward way. So basically, the bishops start by the simple question, what is racism? And they give a very succinct answer. They say that racism is the sin of Cain. It's the sin that tells us that we are not children of the same God. It's the sin that says to us that some human life has more dignity or is more valuable than other human life. So racism, they say very plainly, is sin. And it is sin that is rooted in our human fallacy of superiority, right? That because I am me and I'm not like you, being like me is better than being like you. That's fallacy and it's sin that is as old as Eden. The bishops actually start with the example of Cain. And then they take as kind of moving forward from that question of what is racism, they frame the rest of the letter around this quote from the prophet Micah, which we've all heard. You have been told, O mortal, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk humbly with your God. And so the rest of the letter takes up those three elements, right? Doing justice, loving goodness, and walking humbly with God. So under the category of doing justice, they actually start by talking about the injustices that have been suffered by various groups within the United States specifically. And what I found very interesting and very brave of the bishops is that they don't flinch from talking about the role of the Catholic Church in that injustice. Talking about the role of the Catholic Church in, for example, the slave trade, talking about the ways in which Catholics of different races and ethnicities were treated unjustly within our own American Catholic Church. So it's a very brief but very powerful reflection and exploration of the experiences specifically of African American Catholics, Native Americans, and Hispanic Latin Americans within the United States, and specifically within the American Church. From there, it moves to loving goodness. And so, now that we have kind of laid out injustice and what justice is supposed to look like in comparison to what we've done, so then we move into this area of loving goodness. And so this is about breaking open our own hearts, right? Breaking open our own hearts and being willing to examine our own racial attitudes, and being willing to see how the legacy of racism has formed and deformed our own experiences, our own ability to see one another as human beings equal in dignity. It speaks about systemic racism in our economic area, within the criminal justice area, within the education area. So it's very, again, succinct, but very powerful. And part of the power of this document is that it doesn't hide behind a lot of fancy words. It really just says it. It just says it. And so I love, there's a quote from this section. It's called, the title is The Urgent Call to Love, right? So how is it that we are to love goodness? Well, first of all, we are to love and understand as Christians what the Christian call to love is. And it says, love compels each of us to resist racism courageously. It requires us to reach out generously to the victims of this evil, to assist the conversion needed in those who still harbor racism, and to begin to change policies and structures that allow racism to persist. So there's not a whole lot of wiggle room there, right? It says what it says, and it means what it says. So it's very powerful in that. The last section talks about walking humbly with God. And so in this section, we deal with the sin of racism, right? We acknowledge that racism is sin, and that all of us have been impacted by this sin. So as Christian people, what do we do with sin? We confess it so that we can be freed from it, and so that we can then go and love God and love neighbor renewed and imbued with the grace of God. So the last section really talks about the spiritual battle of looking into our own hearts, acknowledging the sin of racism that we find there, or of any kind of prejudice that we find there, confessing that humbly, allowing God's grace to come and fill us, and then moving forward from that point. So it really ends on a call to action, right? To look inward to our own hearts first, lest we become hypocrites, right? Pointing out the log in everybody else's eye, pointing out the stick in everybody else's eye and ignoring the log in our own. But doing the work that we need to do within ourselves, and then using that as a starting place to do the work that needs to be done within our church, within our institutions, within our own family, and within the greater society. So that's my little synopsis
That's great.
of this document.
Together. And I know, Nora, you really took this document to heart, and it impacted you in a big way. And I like how Amy said it had a call to action, because you answered that call to action, and then Gloria is even further answering that call to action. And it's a really beautiful evolution that's happening. So Nora, can you talk about your experience and why you decided to be kind of at the forefront of this symposium that was last year in 2019? Is that right?
Right. Well, it was September 19th, 2019, which is the International Day of Peace. That was one of the reasons why we selected that date. But the beginnings, or the genesis of putting on the symposium, goes back to actually 2018. And as a member of the Archdiocesan Ecumenical and Interreligious Commission, I went to the week of Christian unity. And early in 2018, the theme of that was around this idea of race and grace. And so this preceded the bishop's letter coming out, but the idea of the workshop was that in the spirit of Christian unity, we look for the beauty of God's creation in all people, and we celebrate the diversity of how different people recognize God's divinity and how they worship, and we look for the gifts of what the different faith traditions can bring to our understanding of our own spirituality. So in that context of the Christian Unity Workshop, we were talking about the sin of racism. And it was brought to my attention that the bishops were working on this pastoral letter. And it's actually quite unusual for the bishops to put out a letter like this. It doesn't happen on a regular basis. So this call, this enduring call to love, was very important for the bishops to address. And there were a lot of things going on socially in our culture that made it important for this topic to be raised. So I became aware of it at that time. And then another thing that happened was we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Nesti Center for Faith and Culture. So every year in the fall, we have a symposium or a lecture honoring Bishop Fiorenza. And so when it was time to bring together the symposium, the Fiorenza Symposium, and honoring Father Nesti for the 25th anniversary, it just was really put on my heart, this call to action, that we needed to let people in the university community as well as in the community of Houston know that the bishops were calling us to have this internal personal conversion of heart that would lead to action within our community. And so I volunteered to chair this committee and put on this symposium, and we hosted it on the campus in September, and Gloria was one of the people who heard about it and attended.
Yeah. So Gloria, will you share with us your experience of both attending and then also of, we're coming full circle, you went back to St. Ignatius and started working with Amy to get this thing going at St. Ignatius. So will you tell us the way all of that happened?
Well, it actually began right after Harvey. And I had previously co-sponsored a Martin Luther King program in our community. But I'd always wanted to have a Mass for Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday and have an opportunity to discuss issues with some of our parishioners. St. Ignatius is very ethnically diverse. So I thought, well, this would be a very good opportunity to share experiences, not just of African Americans, but all people who feel discriminated against. So our first attempt at that was in January of 2018. And we hosted a Mass in honor of Dr. King. And we also had a panel discussion. And Father Chris Valka from University of St. Thomas was our moderator. And he told us then, I believe it was Father Valka, that there was a pending pastoral letter on racism, and that it should come out later in the fall. So I was waiting for this letter, and it finally came out. I read it. I read and I called some people, and I was like, no, we've never heard of this before. So I waited patiently and kept thinking something's going to happen. We've got to hear about this. So my sister in Austin is part of a group called Courageous Conversations. They've been meeting for over 3 years. And they told me that there was a listening session being held by Bishop Vasquez in Austin, September the 6th. So I went to this listening session, and I was just amazed at some of the things that I heard, some of the pain that I heard in 5 people's stories that they shared with the bishop. Mm-hmm. So I came back and asked Father Reginald Samuels, the parochial vicar for Catholics of African descent, if we were having anything in the Galveston Houston diocese on the letter. And he informed me about the symposium. So that's how I got there. And I met Nora once I got there. I was just amazed at how well put together the conference was. There were various courses that you could go to that you could pick the issues that you were concerned about. And the whole day was just quite a revelation that there was so much work being done that I'd never heard about. Mm-hmm. So I was most grateful to be there and to meet Nora, who was very helpful in sharing information with me. We went back and had a meeting with our parish in October. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised how enthusiastic people were to voice their concerns. We had maybe 25, 28 people, but our guest speaker was Lawrence Payne, who invited each person to introduce themselves and then tell why they were there. And just that simple invitation just provoked a lot of conversation, a lot of revelations about people and the pain that they've shared over racism, not just as a person who's been a victim, but people who know that this is just not right. So we said, okay, well, we want to continue this. So our next one was in January, again, to celebrate Dr. King's birthday. And by then, luckily, Amy had joined us. We had originally started out under our social justice ministry, but it was moved to formation so that we could have this as a regular part of our adult formation program. So Amy gathered up some materials for us. We met around the, I think it was the 25th. Well, it was originally scheduled for the 26th, which was the feast day of St. Oscar Romero, because the Open Wide Our Hearts letter addresses discrimination against Hispanics as well. So we wanted to pick a saint's day and host an event that would celebrate the contributions of all cultures. And so we picked his date. Unfortunately, Corona interrupted that plan, but Amy was not to be daunted. She set up a Zoom conference, and we had a meeting by Zoom. So our next meeting is this coming Wednesday. And we started out studying the first part of the letter, and we'll go to the middle part on this meeting, as well as share some information about Father Oscar Romero, St. Oscar Romero, and have further discussions with our group. So that's where we are right now, but I'm just very thankful to our pastor and the support that he's given to this program, as well as to Amy for keeping us going through this very difficult time.
Yeah, and how would you say, now that you started the program and people are starting to share and be open to this document and what it's bringing about? So for some people, it's bringing up their own issues, and then others are having, to reflect on their own biases. And anyone can comment on this. How do you think that interior struggle is good for helping people to understand the sin of racism and how to move forward as a society?
That's a good question. But I do think people are eager to examine what's gone on, particularly in our country. We have such a history that we buried. And in burying that history, we buried a lot of pain and a lot of biases that people both, not just an oppressor, but the oppressed, who need to unburden themselves and decide that it's time to get rid of this baggage that we carry and lead a more generous, a fuller life. And just as the letter says, to do justice, love goodness, and walk humbly with our God.
I think it is a scary topic for some people. Just in the past few years, I've had several experiences in my pastoral ministry that have made it very clear to me just how frightening this conversation can be for people, and especially for white people. This is a conversation that a lot of our white brothers and sisters are very afraid to have, because there is this great anxiety that goes with this discussion of race. I was telling my husband, it had never occurred to me before, because, my family is French Creole. We come in all different colors. So race is something that just very naturally we discuss, because we don't have the other choice. When I go places with my children and people are asking, about the race of my children because they can't seem to imagine that these brown children belong to me, right? It's not a conversation I can avoid. And so it had never occurred to me until I had a couple of experiences just this past year that there are families where race is never a discussion, where it's taboo even to talk about race and the fact that people look different, that they express their spirituality differently based on their upbringing, based on, their heritage and just where they've grown up. Mm-hmm. And so what's been eye-opening for me about this document is that it really is an opening up, right? It's an invitation to, just as the gospel says, do not be afraid. That if we root a conversation in love, and specifically in the love of God, and in the dignity of the human person, it's not that the conversation is always going to be easy. It's not that it's always going to be comfortable. But as long as we remember that Christ is with us in the midst of that conversation, it's going to be okay. Like Jesus is going to help us to find the peace and the courage that we need to do the work he's calling us to do. I talk about courageous humility, right? That when God asks you to do a thing, it's not because you're so special, right? Because everybody's special and you're not more special than anybody else. But when God asks us to do a thing, just do it. And be brave, because it's God who's asked it of you. Because it's not about how qualified or capable you are. It's about how good and how faithful our God is. So we don't have to be afraid to have these conversations, because God is calling us to be reconciled and to have these difficult conversations so that we can be reconciled.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I was very excited to hear that your church, St. Ignatius, was addressing this letter as a part of the adult faith formation. And I think that's exactly where it belongs, because of what you're pointing out. This is fundamental to our faith. This isn't something new or separate or different. This is rooted in what we believe about how God created everyone in his own image, and we all share the same dignity. And it's fundamental that we as Catholic Christians talk about that. And it applies to this issue of race, as well as to the issue of Christian unity, or unity with people who even have a different religious affiliation or no religious affiliation. We are all made in the image and likeness of one God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that the way that y'all are unfolding it too, because it's rooted in love. It's showing people that we're all made in God's image. It's a completely different way of framing this conversation of racism, right? Like, and both you and Gloria had mentioned like the unburdening of yourself and the invitation so that you're not afraid. How do you see this as an open dialogue for Catholics of all races to just have that conversation in a very safe space?
I don't know that safe is the word, mm-hmm. because it's not a safe conversation. Mm-hmm. We can have a nice program where we all get up and sing "We Shall Overcome," and we read 1 Corinthians 13, all about how we're gonna love each other and hold hands and sing "Kumbaya" and go right out that door without really having had to do much of changing at all. Right. So it's not a safe conversation; it's a holy conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I think when we frame it in terms of holiness, right? I'm not here because I want to be safe. Mm-hmm. I'm here because God calls me to holiness. Mm-hmm. And racism is sin. Mm-hmm. And sin and holiness don't go together. And so helping people, and I mean, and let's be honest, the folks who are showing up for our programs are the people who are already open to this idea, right? These are not the people who deny that, you know, racism exists. These are not the open, active racists who are showing up. At least if they're showing up, they got the good sense to keep their mouth shut. So this is about, right now, it's about empowering and enabling people of good faith to have those conversations, right, in their own lives. It's about, I forget, I've been on so many conferences these past few days, but somebody said something about preaching to the choir. And I said, that's okay, because sometimes the choir needs to be preached to also. You know, the choir leaves here and we're singing all by ourselves. We think we're the only ones that know the words. Right. So it's good to encourage those of us who are open to this conversation, but also to look for ways to increase the conversation, right? To invite others in a way that is holy. Not that is safe, but that is holy, that sees their dignity as a person and calls forth that conversation based on the fact that you are a human being equal in dignity to me. Right. And so as two human beings equal in dignity, we can speak to one another in love and holiness, even if we don't agree. Right.
To ensure that that dignity, we do provide ground rules that we ask people to follow. We go over them at the beginning of the sessions, and we just let them know that, you know, this isn't a debate. We're not trying to change your mind. You see things in a worldview that is very different and sometimes from other people, but we want you to hear what other people experience. We want you to feel the pain that some people experience every day, even today. And it's really sad when you experience it in your own church. We talked earlier about the separation of the church into the white church and the black church or the Hispanic church. We are one church, and we're trying to find a way so that all of us can be there comfortably in our own cultures, recognizing our own diversity, but still one church. And we do that in a way that recognizes the dignity and value of each person.
Yes.
Well,
that's beautifully said, Gloria.
Yeah, it really brings it all together. And I love how y'all are just keep bringing it back to the holiness, to the way that we were created, what we're meant for with our relationships, the beauty of those relationships, how they're supposed to flourish rather than how right now they're severed by this sin. And so if people want to get involved, or, you know, if people have questions, maybe Nora, they want to reach out to you, because we're going to send this to those who attended the symposium. Gloria, how do people attend the Saint Ignatius classes? And then Nora, maybe you could share contact information so that they could comment or get in touch with you as well.
Amy sends out an email that has our Zoom conference information. I'm new to Zoom, so she's much better at it than I am. But feel free to send it to me, and I can add you to the list. Okay. My email is gmaldridge@att.net. GMALDRIDGE@att.net.
Great. And Nora?
I'm at nora.creech, nora.creech@yahoo.com. And Gloria and I have been brainstorming a little bit about pursuing the idea of having a listening session in our archdiocese. That is one of the calls to action in the letter, and it's something we would love to see happen in our archdiocese. So if there are other people interested in that, we'd love to hear.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful dialogue and this wonderful conversation to help broaden people's minds and open them up to this document and the sin that we already have and experience, and also the call to address our own biases and then come out of that with love and to encounter the other in a way that's meaningful and life-giving. So thank you everyone for joining us as well. And if you have any questions, you can leave a comment or reach out to any one of these ladies. You can Google St. Ignatius and find Amy pretty easily on their website as well. So thank you again, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Bridget.
Bridget.